always like to start with a quick discussion about wild oysters. And I think that I am kind of preaching to the choir when I talk about the decline in the oyster population over the years. I know you all are engaged in oyster restoration efforts, so you're well aware of it, but let's just quickly look at some numbers. So, you know, historically, 2 million to 5 million bushels per year. We're talking about from the 1930s all the way up to the 1990s, early 1990s, and certainly the late 1980s. Actually had quite substantial wild oyster harvests. But just to kind of put it in perspective, and you get the actual numbers, if you're 300 oysters per bushel is what the Daily Press decided to go with. I'm not, it's certainly not more than that. It could be less than that depending on the size of the oysters, but if you're talking about annual harvests of 2 to 5 million bushels per year, you're talking about annual $600 million. 600 million oysters, or 1.5 billion oysters. So that is that's a huge number. It's just enormous. And one of the things I wanted to do and haven't had time was to compare other businesses in Maryland, other industries in Maryland, and see what kind of revenue, I wonder, what sort of revenue does, any other type of farming, corn farming, or, apples, or, tomato, some of these staple products in Maryland, or even, for that matter, if an oyster is worth 50 cents, which is what I sell them for wholesale, what business out there has a value, a market value of $750 million a year. Maybe at that level we're getting into, I don't know, like healthcare consulting in Maryland. I can't imagine it's much more than $750 million. But at least we're talking about a lot of jobs, like a crazy amount of jobs, and a big part of the economic engine of the Chesapeake Bay. And then you look at what the Daily Press reported, and this is coming from DNR numbers from 2015 and 2016 season, the wild harvest dropping from 2 million to 5 million bushels all the way to 260,000 bushels, which equates to, at that number, 300 oysters per bushel, about 78 million oysters. So the decrease is really remarkable. And I would argue that if this had happened to any other species, any other animal in the Chesapeake Bay, there would be a moratorium on that animal immediately, just like there was the rockfish. And why that hasn't taken place is a mystery. And frankly, I think when I say that, people say, well, of course you want a moratorium on wild oysters because that's going to help your business. No, it won't at all. I don't compete with wild oysters at all. Never. I have never, ever come across a customer that says, I'm not going to buy your oyster because I'm going to buy a wild oyster. Not once has that happened since I started selling oysters. It's a completely different market.
But to the uninformed consumer, there might be that confusion.
Sure, to the uninformed consumer, but I would argue that if there were a moratorium on wild oysters, you would take a lot of the restaurants in this area, which buy wild oysters and sell them, and they would just not offer oysters. They wouldn't buy my oyster, and trust me, I know those people. I know the customers. I know the buyers, and they would just, instead of selling an oyster for $3 a piece, like my customers do, they would just not sell oysters. And part of that is a consumer thing, but to come into, I don't know, any bar in Annapolis or down in Solomon's Island, those areas, and say, well, we're charging $3 an oyster, you'd probably get your head blown off or something. It's just, that's not going to happen. I think they would just take them off the menu. But my customers, the farm-raised oyster customers, are in the cities. They're hotels. They're high-end restaurants. They're the same places that are selling tuna tartare and lobster, and there are plenty of those places to go around, and those are the places that the farm-raised oysters, the production goes after, because it's impossible to compete with the cost, the price, the market price of the wild oysters, seeing as how there's very little input in fishing for them, and if we had to compete with that price, there wouldn't be a farm-raised industry. The numbers just wouldn't add up. I can't sell oysters for 30 cents a piece. I wouldn't be able to pay my payroll, or the gas, or the electricity, or the rent. Yeah.
Is that a volume problem?
No, it's the short answer is no.
At the scale you can get, if you scale up, it's still going to cost the same for oysters.
I think that you could, but first of all, there are systemic problems in the Chesapeake Bay to scaling. So I would say that politically, and what's the word, socially, it's impossible to scale to the size that would allow a 30-cent oyster.
As opposed to farming fish, which creates a huge amount of pollution, this reduces it, right?
Yep. And again, I think we're preaching to the choir when we talk about how the scalability of oyster farming is a positive thing. But the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of opposition. And yep.
You can't get enough access.
Yeah, quality.
Yeah, and also it's the visibility of a large-scale commercial operation in neighborhoods that don't want to see that. They call it NIMBY, not in my backyard, folks. And I get that. I totally get that. I mean, it's actually not that unreasonable when you think about it. I mean, people buying beautiful waterfront property in an area that has, for generations and generations, been very, calm and serene and scenic and quiet. And then some kid from Baltimore comes in and says, hey, I'm going to grow, 100 million oysters a year. I get it. That's not okay. So I think gradually there will be companies, but I can also say that on the West Coast, where you have farms who are, 5th generation, 6th generation, you have communities that are used to seeing buoys and boats and oyster cages and oyster floats, and that they're okay with it. It's part of the normal life. In fact, some people consider it a pleasant thing to look at out over the water. It's cute, it's neat, it's cool. Even those farms, the biggest farms in the country, are still selling their oyster at 50 to 60 cents a piece. And it's not like the owners are buying a new Cadillac every year. I mean, it's a tough business. The margins are thin, and to get to that point where you're selling, to get to that, what is it called? Economies of scale. I can't imagine what that would look like in the Chesapeake Bay there, because it would be huge. Yeah.
I've heard it alleged that the regulatory situation is somehow more favorable in Virginia than Maryland. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is dramatically more favorable. I'll give you a perfect example. I started our farm in 2000, I guess it was 2012, when I put the first oyster in the water, the first seed oyster in the water. And at that time, there was this guy, Tom, and he was my age, still is, and he was working as a farm manager for a guy, JD, who owns a farm near mine called 38 Degrees North. Yep. So his farm is 38 degrees north, and he is about a 15-minute car ride from me. And Tom is working there. And in 2000, so that was 2012. In 2015, I think, he left and opened an oyster farm in Virginia. And within a year, was selling oysters. So from the time that he submitted to say, here's my paperwork to the government. I don't know what the entity, the equivalent of DNR in Virginia. Here's my paperwork, I've completed it all, here's my name, here's whatever information, here's the coordinates of the place that I want, and I want your blessing to go ahead and start growing oysters. From a year, he was actually selling it. So he was able to buy larger oysters, put them in his water, let them absorb the taste, and farm them for a while and then sell them. On the contrary, I sold my first oyster in 2013, and I submitted my paperwork in 2010. So it took him 1 year, and it took me over 3 years.
Because of the states, the different
Yeah, because of the different
regulations.
Regulatory paths you have to go through. And there has been a little bit of improvement in the way that permitting and regulation happens in the state of Maryland, but it's still the #1 biggest barrier to entry for getting into oyster aquaculture. I'd say even more than the financial barrier to entry, which is significant. It's the fact that you basically have to say, okay, I'm gonna become an oyster farmer. I'm gonna switch careers, or I'm gonna focus on this new project now, and then you don't get to plant anything for at least 2 years from the time you submit the paperwork. So it takes 3 to 6 months to complete the paperwork and do it right, and then they get some feedback, whatever, you're done. And then it takes 2 years for them to process it and give you an okay. So it's really, it's a solid 3 years. And that's a long time to go without any revenue, without anything to show for it. And all the while, you're gonna have to be, doing other things and have a full-time job doing something else. It's just so difficult. And I was lucky to be in a position where I was working as a paralegal for a firm out of DC, and the partner in the law firm was just extremely supportive of what I was doing, and I could kind of come and go, and had 1 foot at the farm, 1 foot in the law firm, and was making enough money to get by while I was running the oyster farm. And he just kept patting me on the back and saying, "You're doing a great job, keep going." And but I just shake my head when I think of other people trying to get into the business. It's so difficult. So, and another part of that answer is the fact that oyster farming and the privatization of water is an older and more integrated concept in Virginia than it is in Maryland. In Maryland, it started, the very first privatization of water to grow oysters in Maryland was, I think, in the 90s. And in Virginia, it was close to the turn of the century, like 1900. So you do have third-generation oyster farmers in Virginia, whereas you only have first-generation oyster farmers in Maryland. And by first generation, I mean nobody's been in the business longer than 15 years. So that's but so I like to show people this graph that puts into perspective that, and this is just Virginia, so not Maryland. This is just Virginia's wild oyster harvest, and it's from the Washington Post. This is an article about what's happened to the wild oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay. And what I like to ask people, and I'll just skip straight to it, but I like to ask you what you think the title of this article was in the Washington Post. Because I get this question all the time. People come up to me and say, "Oh, you're an oyster farmer, that's cool. How is the oyster season?" And I kind of have to back up and say, okay, well, first of all, there is no oyster season with me, and I think what you're asking is how was the wild oyster season, because it's kind of a fishery thing, and that really doesn't have anything to do with me. But I will say, if you look at, this is 2011, that black number right there. And yeah, if you zoom in on this time period right here, it looks like there's a pretty steep increase there, right? And so the news, the Washington Post reports, go to the next slide, they kind of forget about the big picture, and they say Chesapeake Bay oysters appear to be in recovery mode. What? How can you look at that graph? And I took that chart straight from the article. That was the chart that they put in the article. How on earth can you say that they appear to be in recovery mode? And then go to the next slide. I like to compare it to something that everybody's familiar with, a Ravens game. So there's 50,000 fans, and if you ask yourself what 2% looks like, you know, that's 1,000 people in a stadium that's roughly the same size. So if 20 more people showed up to this bottom screen, would you say, wow, the crowd's in recovery mode? Or would you say, no, it's still abysmal? Like, there's no way. So, you know, it's just one of those things that's always been very shocking to me about how not just the government, you know, but really the media sort of decides to tell the story of what's really happening in the Chesapeake Bay as far as the wild oyster goes. Then I kind of switched gears into, you know, oysters being a keystone species of the Chesapeake Bay, and this is a slide where, for most people who aren't kind of like this group, you know, educated about, well, what exactly is an oyster, and why is it important to the environment, as this is where I would get into that, but I don't need to talk about that. I think you guys all familiar with that. So, let's see. I think everybody's familiar. I saw the model spat on shell at that table, so I think everybody's familiar with one of the fundamental differences between oyster aquaculture, what I do, and what I would call, say, oyster aquaculture for restoration purposes. The oysters that I raise are, there are two ways people describe it. One way is culchless, and that's kind of a oversimplification, because culch would be the shell that, or anything that an oyster larvae attaches to and becomes an oyster. To say that our oysters are culchless is actually not true. It's just the correct term that the industry uses is microculch, yeah. So when I buy seed, I say I want, you know, 10 million microculch as opposed to spat on shell. And the reason is because I can much better control the quality and the, you know, appearance of a single oyster than I can a clump. And really, without the microculch technology, so to speak, which isn't really technology, it's just grinding up the oyster shell into tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces, you actually do have to buy a special machine that can crush it to, I think it's like 50 microns, and anything bigger than 50 microns, and you're going to get doubles and triples and quadruple little clumps, and I can't sell a clump. I just can't sell it.
Can you speak a little bit more to the half-shell market and why it's
Yeah, I mean, so
value added, right?
Yeah, it is a value add, absolutely. So, you know, the clump versus the single oyster, I think, is, you know, yeah, it's the ability to plate them, it's the ability to sell them and know exactly how many you're selling, know exactly how many you have in your inventory, and frankly, it's what the market demands now. I mean, if you're trying to sell a product that has other oysters kind of attached to its shell, you know, good luck, because you're going to face a lot of competition out there that has beautiful shells that are immaculate and have nothing on them, and people can, you know, look at them in fancy oyster bars and ooh and ah how beautiful the shells are, and that's the market. So the other thing is, in order to, what the watermen do, or what, you know, one would have to do with a clump of oysters like that, is hit it with a hammer. And what does that do? It kills a whole bunch of oysters. So, you know, it's not an efficient way of doing it. It's not a reasonable way of doing it. It is in a way that, you know, will get you at that level in the market to be able to sell a 50-cent oyster and make your payroll and make your lease payments and all that. So our farm is located down in St. Mary's County, all the way down near Point Lookout, in a place called St. Jerome. Has anybody here ever been to St. Jerome? All right, nice. It's a beautiful spot, right? Nice and quiet. It's actually one of the few riparian creeks in the Chesapeake Bay. And riparian rights creek is defined as a body of water that is more has more than 20 miles of shoreline and a mouth out into the bay that is less than 300 feet. So it's actually legally a very specific type of body of water, and it got that notoriety because of the fact that historically these riparian creeks were used as safe haven for ships to be able to come in, or boats, or who were travelers, etc., on the water, to be able to come in and find safe haven because they were open spaces with more than 20 miles of shoreline, but protected with only a 300-foot long mouth. So it was a great place for people to kind of seek refuge in storms. So they developed a particular kind of protection under the law, and it has to do with the people who live there and what rights they have to the water in front of them, and yeah, very interesting, but also kind of boring. But it's great for oyster farming because it's protected, and we can go out there and do the things we need to do on the farm even in bad weather. You can see our boat there. We have the Carolina skiff that has a canopy on top, and we designed it with a commercial crabber who used that hydraulic crab wheel, the arm that comes out. It's the same exact device. You can kind of see it up there attached to the top of the canopy, and it's the same exact device that crabbers use to bring up the crab pots. And it turned out that that kind of design worked really well for what we have, which are those oyster cages there. So we raise the oysters in tanks. You can see here the microculture oysters. Once they get to be about that size, they go out into the cages, and then we periodically will go and pick them up. If you go to the next slide, this is just kind of a simplified version of what we're doing. You know, the cages have buoys to let us know where they are, and we go along with our wheel and pick them up, and that's kind of the way that they live. But they, you know, blend in with the surrounding environment very well and provide habitat for you know, a wide variety of species. And you can check out our website. We actually have a really cool part of our website that talks about sustainability and what we call beyond sustainability, which is that oyster farming is not just sustainable, it's restorative, which is a very unique attribute for an industry.
Did you draw that? Is that your sketch?
I did not draw that. I couldn't draw that to save my life. And the next slide is something interesting. On the right, this is a document that I found just doing some research one day years ago. And you can see the date on it, August 14th, 1882. And it says, plan of oyster collection station at St. Jerome Creek, Maryland. So in the text above it, it mentions that the properties of St. Jerome Creek make it an ideal location for farming oysters, or what back in 1882 they described as the artificial breeding, artificial cultivation of oysters. So this was the very first federally funded oyster aquaculture project in the country. Was in St. Jerome Creek in Maryland. And it was the United States Commission for Fish and Fisheries, which is the predecessor for NOAA. And of all the places in the country, they chose St. Jerome Creek because, as it says, oysters of excellent quality abound. And when I arrived on St. Jerome Creek the first time in 2010, there were 0 oysters in the creek. Literally, there wasn't a single oyster. I walked around, you know, the whole creek is about 5 feet, most of the creek. There's some more shallow, some deep, but roughly 5 feet. I walked around everywhere in bare feet, not a single oyster, nothing. There was a small oyster farm there when I got there, which was one of the first to ever get a permit in the state of Maryland, but you know, now we have over 10 million oysters under cultivation, and you know, hopefully it's doing some good for the water quality and the environment around it. I mean, I certainly have noticed a difference. Don't have any data to back it up, but you know, from what we know about the oyster, it can only be benefiting St. Jerome Creek. So, and those water, you know, properties still, as you can see in the map, still remain today. We do like to think our oysters of excellent quality. So we sell two different kinds of oysters. Essentially, they're the same oyster. They're just a different size grade. What we figured out was some restaurants like small oysters and some restaurants like big oysters. So we couldn't put them in the same box and sell them under the same name. So it's strictly marketing. It's just marketing 101. And we, you know, harvest the oysters and we separate them. The 2-inch oysters go over here and go into that box, and the 3 to 4-inch oysters go over here and go into that box. And we market them as two different brands, and we have customers that are interested in one brand and not the other, or customers that are interested in both, and some that are interested in neither. So we like the Skinny Dipper because it's a nice big shell. It's great to cook with. As you can see, you can put a lot of ingredients in that shell. We have a lot of customers that buy them to do oysters Rockefeller, you know, other kind of baked oysters, you know, charbroiled oysters. So lots of fun stuff you can do with Skinny Dippers. And we came up with the name, another marketing thing. We just wanted the name to pop off of a menu, pop off of a chalkboard. We just wanted it to be different, fun, something that people would remember.
And I also remember the tagline, when is the last time you did something for the first time, right?
Exactly. That was how we, yeah, I'm glad you remember that. That was kind of how we came up with it. I was with my family and we were talking about how crazy it is where people get embarrassed when they're eating their first oyster. And everybody looks at them, oh, it's your first oyster, like, wow. And you don't see that if someone's like, oh, I've never had a hot dog before. Nobody gets up, oh my God, this is your first hot dog? Really? Well, I had my first hot dog, gosh, it probably must have been when I was 12. And I've been eating hot dogs my whole life. And, you know, it's just something about oysters that people start talking about it. And then if it's, you know, my sister, I remember one of her friends came over and she's like, oh, I don't want anybody to watch me eat my first oysters. So she's like doing one of these. And, you know, and so we were talking, you know, when's the last time you really remember doing something for the first time? Like people remember with an oyster, for example. And my dad was like, skinny dipping. I remember the first time I went skinny dipping, and I was like, yep, there you go. That's what we'll call the oyster. So the other one, we wanted an oyster that the small oyster tends to be what people gravitate towards first when they decide to eat their first oyster. Or when they might not be really interested. Oh, I've had oysters before, but I don't really like them that much. Well, it's just a tiny oyster. Okay, I'll try that one. And, oh, wow, you're right. It's really good. I forgot how much I liked oysters. You know?
Gateway oyster.
Yeah, so we wanted it to be about adventure. We wanted it to be about, hey, don't be boring. You know, go out there and eat an oyster. That's the fun thing to do. You know, it's adventurous. So we came up with calling it the Huckleberry Oyster after the famous adventurer Huck Finn. And they're great with oyster shooters. So our oyster is a unique soft salt flavor. It's got a little bit of the saltiness from the Atlantic, a little bit of the fresher water from the northern Chesapeake Bay. They're exceptionally clean compared to what some chefs are used to seeing. We grade them, as I said, to make sure they're the same size. So, yeah, we got on the next slide. Cool, so this, as Brian mentioned, this is our next project. We just opened a restaurant in Baltimore, and it's called True Chesapeake Oyster Company. We opened 2 weeks ago, so this is actually the first dinner service that I'm not physically there for, but I'm sure they're doing a great job. And it's a 150-seat restaurant. We feature, everything from the Chesapeake Bay. We've got monkfish on the menu tonight. We've got bluefish, pate. We have clams. We have oysters. We have crab cakes. We have a fantastic crab soup. We have some great steaks. Our phrase that we're toying with is True Chesapeake Oyster Company, come for the oysters and stay for the steak. So it's a fun project. So if you ever find yourself in Baltimore, please stop by. There are, it's in Hamden. Yep, it's in the Hamden neighborhood of Baltimore. Right near Woodbury Kitchen and La Cuchara, 2 restaurants that are doing well there.
Seating capacity.
150 seats, and you can make reservations on Open Table. And if you go to truechesapeake.com, you'll see all about the restaurant and the farm. Yeah.
Can you say something about the oyster season, both the farming and wild catch,
Yeah.
and the, how do you say, the consumption season?
Yeah.
Is oyster consumption steady month by month year round, or does it?
Or do the R months still get people?
Yeah. The wholesale oyster industry does not see an ebb and flow in oysters. It's consistent. In fact, if you talk to some distributors that focus on certain customers, like bars that are downtown, they say their oyster season starts on St. Patrick's Day. So March, that's when it starts. So if you're selling to a bar that has a lot of college kids, a lot of outdoor seating, patio, they're watching baseball games or whatever, then the patio, the outdoor season starts in March, and then it goes in April, May, June, and the places are packed, and they're doing happy hour oysters, they're doing oyster shooters, all that jazz, right? Maybe if you talk to other distributors that focus on more white tablecloth places, they may say, yeah, our oyster season starts right around now. You get into September, October, you get closer to Thanksgiving. Our customers tend to start coming in, they're asking for oysters, they're asking for oyster stew, all that kind of stuff. But it really depends on who you're selling to, and there's such a wide variety of customers these days that, True Chesapeake, the demand for our oysters stays pretty consistent. And the wild oyster has a season because of reproduction.
Because of the regs, yeah.
Yeah, because of the regulations. Yeah, they're forced into a season. So
What is that season?
so they're
October through March.
yeah. Yeah, October 1st, probably till the end of March.
And there's a sliding scale on the end depending on how cold, how much freeze in the winter.
Yeah.
They have an adjustment as you come out of the season in March.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Department of Natural Resources, because wild oysters are a natural resource, regulates that. And they have, the ability to enforce that with the law. And they can fine people for harvesting wild oysters when they're not allowed to and selling them. It's a serious thing. You can go to jail. People do go to jail every year for doing it. And the same as rockfish. If you're selling a rockfish outside of season or selling rockfish that are too small or whatever, it's just jail time. It's not just a slap on the wrist. Like, you will go to jail and you will pay a huge fine.
But what's
So-
the thing of eating in our months originally because of pathogens at the restaurant?
That's twofold. So one is the fact that oysters spawn in the summer, in the warm months.
Yeah.
So you have a shriveled up oyster. So you want to eat a meaty, plump oyster. So you wouldn't eat them in the summer because of that. Second thing is, yes, back in the day, lack of refrigeration, before they were stricter, health regs, it was, the higher chance of Vibrio and disease. So the R months were the colder months where the oysters were safer in transport, and also they were not reproducing and losing body mass.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's about reproduction and refrigeration. I think at some point it was about demand too, and sort of tradition, right? I'm trying to think of other, products that just kind of like turkey.
Yeah.
Great example. It's like, why do people? Okay, it's just tradition. There's no reason why you can't eat a turkey in August, but so so as because my oysters are not a natural resource. They're an investment that I've made. I've, you know, bought them and own them. The government is kind of, you know, hands off on that. In the warmer months, it's not the warm water that is the problem. It's the warm air that's the problem. So when oysters or any shellfish, you know, and any mollusk are exposed to warm air, the bacteria, Vibrio being one of those bacteria, grows really, really fast. So that they have specific regulations for farms that control what time of day you can harvest. So most farms cannot harvest past 10 a.m. because the sun is just too bright. That hot air, you know, just the bacteria grows too fast. You have to harvest in shade. So wherever you're pulling the oysters out, that's why our boat has a canopy on, because we need the shade to, you know, and the shade makes a huge difference in the temperature, the air temperature. And then you have 10 hours to get the product down to below 50 degrees. And once it's below 50 degrees Fahrenheit in a refrigerator, then the bacteria doesn't grow any longer. And that's why they call it the cold chain. That's why having distribution partners that you trust is so important, because, you know, you wouldn't want there to be an abuse of temperature somewhere down the line in terms of getting it from our farm to a distribution hub, onto a truck, out to Chicago, to a distribution hub in Chicago, to a distribution center in Chicago, to a company, to a restaurant, to an oyster shucker, to a customer. That's the cold chain. And you want to make sure that everybody in that chain is on the same page as far as how important it is to keep the product safe. So,
speaking of, how far does your oyster travel in the U.S. or worldwide? At one time we sent oysters to China, well, Hong Kong, which today I'm not sure. But yeah, we did send oysters to Hong Kong once, and it turned out that was the federal government regulates international shipments to the point where it was not cost effective for us to do that. But we ship oysters every week to California, and so that's the furthest they go. And we ship every week to Houston, every week to Chicago, Atlanta. Surprisingly, not so much in the Northeast. Just every now and then we'll get orders from Boston, Philadelphia a little bit, but nothing north of Boston, and even Boston is pretty rare. And I think it's just because there's so many oysters up there. It's crazy. And they're not just oysters, the farms. I mean, just in the Boston area, there are probably 1,000 farms. And you know, if you go and look in places like Duxbury Bay or Cape Cod, I mean, there are literally hundreds of farms in those areas. And you know, who knows? Some days the Chesapeake Bay might look similar. I certainly hope it does. Yeah.
In a blind taste test, can most consumers distinguish between a wild-caught oyster and a farm oyster?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's the difference?
If they're growing side by side in the same waterhouse.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would like to hear your opinion too. I mean, I would say yes, just because so here, let me back up a second. There are two ways of growing oysters, two fundamental ways of growing oysters: on bottom and off bottom, right? So and on bottom aquaculture is still aquaculture. It's still not a wild oyster. It's still a person, an individual who has chosen to make an investment. You're all talking about raising $50,000 to, you know, grow oysters. So it's not cheap, right? And so I went out and did that too. And I raised, you know, $1 million and built an oyster farm. And I chose to raise my oysters off the bottom because I see the demand for an off-bottom oyster that has that really clean flavor, because it never spends any time on the bottom, in the muck, in the mud, in the silt, in the sand, any of that.
So do you mean floats, or do you mean elevated cages. Like
So I would say cages and floats are the same type. They're both off bottom. On bottom is what you would call spat on shell aquaculture. It's dredging. There's no gear involved. There's nothing lifting the oysters up. So no, you could not tell the difference between a wild oyster and a on bottom aquaculture oyster, like what you all are doing. That's on bottom aquaculture. That is a very difficult business to be in if you're trying to sell the oysters. It's a great business to be in if your goal is to, support the environment. That's because it's growing the oyster reef. But an off bottom, either a cage or a floated oyster versus a wild oyster, you would be able to tell the difference because the wild oyster is going to be gritty. It's going to have that old school taste. I mean, I'm not saying it's better or worse necessarily. I mean, I grew up on wild oysters. My dad would use a screwdriver and shuck bushels of oysters, and they're great, but they have grit. They have taste of something, like kind of, I don't know, mud even. Like they're a wild oyster, right? They're kind of, but a farm raised oyster, a float or a cage, it's going to be remarkably clean. You're going to open it up and it's going to be, the inside of the shell is going to be white, and it's just because they've been raised in this kind of ideal environment where they don't have any interaction with the bottom. And the first thing that people say when they eat my oyster or really any other farm-raised oysters and they've never had them before, they go, wow, that is clean. It just has this taste that's just,
Can you distribute it through the tripod?
No.
I assume there's a tripod.
Yeah.
The triploid and diploid would be something that you couldn't tell
No.
from flavor.
And you can't tell from looking at them either. I mean, there's no way. That's a issue with the chromosomes. So you would need a special kind of microscope in order to tell the difference between a diploid and a triploid. And by the way, when I say I farm triploids, I mean, yes, I buy triploid seed, but at least 20% of the triploids that are produced are diploids. It's not a perfect science. And by the way, another thing I love, in another presentation I have a picture of watermelon.
Oh yeah, you talk about the seedless. Yeah, that's a good
And the people that were responsible for marketing watermelon, the U.S. Watermelon Association, great group of people. They knew exactly what they were doing. They said, look, industry folks, we've got this new technology. We're able to selectively breed these watermelons to where they're infertile. And what does that do? It gives you a stronger rind, big green rind, nice and thin, very strong. You can take it in a truck and it'll rattle around and it won't break. Your loss gets reduced. And oh yeah, it grows in half the time that your wild watermelon does, right? And they said, instead of calling these triploid watermelons, let's call them seedless watermelons. Because doesn't that sound a little bit better? Triploid sort of sounds like it's a robot or something, or that it's genetically modified or whatever. So the bozos at the oyster industry decided to say, it's a triploid oyster, and so another thing, a navel orange. Anybody heard of a navel orange? Doesn't that sound delicious? It's a triploid orange. That is exactly what it is. It is the same thing where you take an orange that has 4 chromosomes and you breed it with an orange that has 2 chromosomes, and you come out with a 3 chromosome orange. And that orange, if you were to take it and plant those seeds, it's not going to grow an orange tree. It's nature. But that orange is going to have a great rind, a nice big fruit. I mean, you go into the grocery store, right? You see the organic oranges or whatever, and that's great, and they're kind of small, and that's fine. And you go into Giant, and they have these giant, juicy oranges. And, those are great for the economy of growing oranges. And, without a triploid oyster, I wouldn't be in business. It's just a fact. It would not work. The numbers would not work.
Why not?
The loss, first of all, would be just catastrophic. I mean, we've tried growing diploids back in 2011, 2012, 2013. I mean, the average oyster dies within 3 years. That's just nature. And sometimes I think about it and I think, that makes sense, because an oyster is you know, Mother Nature, biology. It's trying to build a reef. So let's take one more step back, right? Let's talk about how oysters reproduce. It is a freaking miracle. And I'm sure that someone who studies how humans reproduce would say the exact same thing. Boy, is it a miracle. A sperm and an egg find each other and whatever. But if a male oyster is over here and a female oyster is over here, and they spit out sperm here and egg here, and you're in the Chesapeake Bay where you've got currents and other animals and all these things going on, how on earth do these two oysters find that they produce the sperm and the egg and they come along in the water? Like, if I drop something in the water and I'm going after it, it's hard enough if I'm trying to catch it. Whereas if you're an oyster, you need a critical mass. You need a big heaping mass of oysters in order to get a spat set and really have it be successful. I mean, 31%, I'm not calling BS, but I would be absolutely shocked if that was the actual number. I mean,
31% is on the spec. 2% is just
yeah, right. And so, but so when you take it back to the diploid versus triploid thing, the fact that your average oyster dies within 3 years, in fact, I would take out my phone and show you a text message. We have kept this oyster, my farm manager's name is Ethan. He's been with us since the beginning, great guy. He named an oyster that was born in 2010, Ethan Jr. And it just died a couple of years ago. But and there's a picture of it, and the thing is like this big, and it just sort of cracked open. We went, oh man, and we thought it was going to live forever. But, you know, so 2010, so it lived for 9 years. And that was one oyster out of, I don't even know how many millions of oysters. I mean, of course, we sold a lot of them, but like, you would think that we would have at least a cage full of big, giant oysters that we wanted to save and see how long we could, but none of them make it. And we have been collecting. We've been like, oh wow, look at the size of this oyster. Let's put that aside and see how big it'll be. And then a year later, it's dead.
Is it Journal or MSX? Is it either one of those?
So we get our oysters tested by the Chesapeake Bay Co-op Lab over in Solomon's Island. And every single year, there's about 20% of them that come back. We only test maybe 100 oysters. We'll send in the box. And about 20 of those 100 have dermo. And dermo is what has at least been told to me. I'm not an expert on dermo by any stretch of the imagination. But what I've been told is that dermo is essentially a latent disease that almost all oysters have. And it's just a matter of when it's going to express itself and when it's going to actually become a problem. So basically, the scientists tell me that I have a farm that has 10 million oysters with dermo. And, you know, most of them are going to express that dermo at some point within 3 years. And most of them, 3 to 5, most of them are going to die. And when you combine the predation, blue crabs, which I feel like we should get a tax credit for or something, feeding blue crabs out the wazoo. It's so sad too. You come to a cage and you open up a cage and like half the cage is gone and there's this giant blue crab. It's just like, oh. So, you know, the triploid allows us to sell an oyster in a year and a half or 2 years, really. The average skinny dipper is coming out and being sold at 2 years, and it beats dermo, you know. And our business is not, I mean, I'm not buying a new truck every year. Our margins are razor thin. I'm trying to meet payroll. It's tough every 2 weeks, you know. And when I think about all the challenges that we face and how difficult it is to run an oyster farm, how difficult it is to break a profit, how much risk is involved every winter, you know, if on top of that, someone said, well, you've got to do diploids, you just have to just stick with diploids and that's it, no more triploids, I probably would get out of the business. I wouldn't be able to, you know, realistically promise a return on investment or, you know, a $15 an hour living wage or anything like that. It just wouldn't work. Yeah.
So how did last year's low salinity cause any problems?
Fortunately, it didn't cause mortality problems, but very much in line with your findings you were presenting earlier, it just slowed everything down. So typically, right about now, we would expect about 70% of our 2-year-old oysters to be skinny dipper size, meaning 3 to 4 inches, nice size. Whereas it's more like 30%. It's a low number. It's really surprising. They're alive. They seem to be doing fine, and there's actually no problem with a slow-growing oyster. I mean, they do well, and we can sell them as a huckleberry, and they'll be just fine. But it clearly, I mean, just from a casual perspective of knowing what a 2-year-old oyster looks like on a farm, you know, you go to these cages and pick them up and look at them, and you think, huh, that's interesting. And then, yeah, you look at the rainfall, and you think, okay, well, I guess they just weren't eating as much, or their growth was stunted, or, you know, and the nursery, too. Oh, my gosh. I mean, you know, the nursery, we're able to move oysters. You know, they start out at 500 micron, and they go to 1,000 micron, and they go to 2,000 micron, and then they go to 6 millimeter, and then they go to 12 millimeter. And we're always trying to push them to be able to sit on larger openings so that they get better water flow, so that they get more food. And it's this constant process of like moving them up and getting them to a container where they're not falling through the holes, they're staying in there, but they're getting all that water flow. And we would come back, you know, just week after week and think, geez, it's been 2 months and these guys are still on their 2,000 micron screen. And we would sort them again and they'd all fall through. And, you know, I had to go to my, you know, nursery guys this year and just be like, guys, you're doing everything right. Let's just be patient, and, you know, we're going to be overwintering a lot of seed that, you know, the seed that we planted in like April, you know, normally would be in cages by this time for sure. But, you know, we'll be overwintering it in bags. Yeah.
So do your oysters grow faster than the much colder water in Boston?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And there's pros and cons with that. I mean, you know, you pick up an oyster.
Maybe you need to market your slow-growing oysters, just like the wine that's kept in the cask.
Yeah, yeah. And we do some of that. I mean, the huckleberry, you know, and most of the huckleberries are the same age, if not older, than some of the skinny dippers, you know. And you know, part of the great part about selling the huckleberry is that you go to your oldest cage, you know, first in, first out kind of thing. And you go to the cage that's been in there the longest, and you sort through them. You got all these great oysters, you know, 3 to 4 inches. And then you have a whole bunch of them that are small. And when we first started selling, we had to put them back in the water. And we'd be like, and then we come back a year later, they'd all be dead. And I would think, huh, I wish I could have sold those. But if I sell them as a skinny dipper, I get complaints from chefs and complaints from distributors saying, this isn't a skinny dipper, it's tiny. What are you talking about? I said, well, yes, it is. It's grown in St. Jerome Creek. It's grown on my farm. It tastes just like a skinny dipper. And they said, well, it's not a skinny dipper, so I'm sending the whole box back. You know, but when we developed the Huckleberry brand, we can say, we can get that whole cage. It's 2 years old. The cage has been in the water for 2 years. It's time to sell every single one of these oysters. I'm not taking any more risk. And we package them up as huckleberries or skinny dippers. And they go out and we get a check. So, you know, it's marketing, it's operations, it's risk management, it's all that.
Do you know what your salinity is, more or less?
I'd say if we looked at a chart like yours, that historical sort of chart where our average is 15, right about 15, 12 to 15, and we got down to like 8, which is just like crazy unheard of. And there were some farms too, down in the Coastal Bay area. I'm friends with some farmers in that region that their sales actually got hurt. Because in the same way that a chef or a distributor would send back a box for size issues, they'll send back a box for taste. And they'll shuck these oysters that normally are supposed to be super salty, like Shooting Points, or, you know, anything from like Hog Island, Virginia, or that area, Assateague, Chincoteague. They were selling the oyster and they were getting returns saying, these oysters are not, like, where are you buying these from? You're not growing them yourself because they don't taste salty. And those farmers would, you know, call me up and say, can I sell into your markets because you're used to dealing with customers that want a medium salinity oyster. I sell a high salinity oyster and I'm getting all these returns. So it's been a crazy, you know, like 12, 14 months. you know, all that rain, I hope we don't see it again for a while. And people are saying, oh, how are you doing with the drought? I'm thinking, drought? We're just getting through a friggin' deluge. That, you know, I certainly hope for the next 6 months we see very little rain, because we're just getting back to where, a little bit under where we normally should be, you know. Yeah.
Patrick, do you guys track the oxygen levels, or is it just salinity is the real key for you guys?
Salinity is the real key. We do track dissolved oxygen, but I couldn't tell you about it. We track it. I know that the Department of Natural Resources tracks it. They also track different bacteria levels. You know, it's something that I'll look at every now and then, but I don't, because it's not necessarily a deciding factor in sales and marketing. It's probably something I should pay attention to, you know, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I assume you guys are having, your levels must be much higher than we have in the Severn River when they're pushing down to 4 point, 3 point.
Yeah.
Low. That's really low.
Yeah.
We had a dead zone in the river and all that.
Yeah.
You guys don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, fortunately, I mean, I think we're just far enough south. We're kind of away from, you know, we're just north of the Potomac. So all that fresh water misses us. It goes down and out the bay. And we're south of the Patuxent, but kind of in our creek. So a lot of that fresh water comes down the coast, but doesn't actually make the turn and go in. And another thing that the Department of Environment mentioned, the Department of Environment mentioned is that our creek is pretty uniformly that 4 to 5 feet, which is pretty shallow. And because the water, like the sun hits it and it evaporates the fresh water, our inside the creek is always a little bit higher than the bay, which is, you know, 18, 20, 25 feet deep as soon as you get 50, 100 feet off the shore. And all that water, the sunlight doesn't get through it to sort of evaporate off that top layer of fresh water.
Shallow water is your friend.
Yeah, shallow water is your friend. And when you think about it, that's where oysters thrive. It's the shallow water, and, you know, it's
Closer to the food source.
Closer to the food source, yeah, and slightly higher salinities. You know,
That
yeah.
reminds me, it's just that in the Severn River, we have our oysters 17 feet.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty deep for you guys.
It does, yeah.
It's not ideal.
But there's a spot in Round Bay where it's only like 6 and 7 feet, and sometimes even less. But
Yeah.
It used to be a productive oyster reef, and we've been monitoring that this year.
Yeah.
And I've been wondering all summer, why does the water quality there seem to be more favorable for oysters than the rest of Round Bay? And it seems to be on par with our best area, and maybe it's because it's shallow.
Yeah, certainly could be.
So to respect everyone's time, I'd like to tie a bow on this, but I would like Patrick to take one more minute and kind of talk. You mentioned the sustainability, restorative, like take a little deeper dive into the importance of aquaculture and the restorative nature and how that is better for greater good.
Yeah, I just keep repeating the line, not just sustainable, restorative. And, you know, it's a really unique industry in that the bigger it gets, the more habitat for baby rockfish, the more habitat for gobies. I mean, the more habitat and, you know, propagation of the benthic zone, which is so important to the rest of the ecosystem. You know, it's pretty remarkable that we're able to support other creatures and provide, you know, space for them to you know, mate and hide and live their first few years of life when otherwise they might be eaten or just not find a place to do the things that they need to do. And we joke about it from time to time that our farm is like a blue crab nursery, because, you know, you open up every pod, every cage, every silo, and it's full of tiny little baby blue crabs. And, you know, they're known as kind of enemy number one on the farm, but it's also pretty cool. You know, most businesses, the bigger they get, there are negative impacts of that. You've got to mitigate, and, you know, oh, well, you know, it's doing so well, you know, corn farming or tomato farming or, you know, whatever. You need more of this, more of that, more input, and pretty soon you've got this sort of footprint that becomes problematic. But it would seem that with oyster farming, you know, the bigger it gets, the more beneficial the impact would be, and of course, even more so with what you all are doing with your restoration efforts. So, something that I think the next generation will embrace. Most of the farmers that I know are relatively young people, and most of the people who are opposed to farming are relatively old people, and it seems to be something that is being embraced by the next generation, and hopefully we'll see some support in the next legislative session and legislative sessions to come, and kind of make it easier to get into this business. And the market is huge. There's
It's not saturated. We can keep getting
not
farmers.
even close. I mean, it's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, internationally, nationally, it's a great business, and hopefully it grows. And the other great thing about it is, giving people jobs in areas where jobs are really tough to come by. I mean, I don't know what Ethan would do. I mean, he was just a kid who was born and raised in Ridge, Maryland. The first time he ever crossed over the Solomon's Island Bridge, I was driving him to an oyster event. He'd never been to Baltimore. He was 23 years old and never been to Baltimore. Went to the big city, but he loves it. That's what he wants to do. He's like 5th generation waterman. He wants to live in Ridge. He wants to live that lifestyle. He wants to fish in the afternoons and drink 10-ounce Bud Lights and hang out with his family, and that's what he wants to do. So if that's what he wants to do, what is he going to do for work? He can't be a waterman anymore. It's not an option, and besides that, I mean, there's like the Dollar General and some lucky people who get a job at the Navy base, but he's been able to pay off a student loan of the 2 years that he went to college, from working for us for 5 years, and that's like the meaningful stuff, So that's part of the story. In addition to the sustainability and restorative nature of what we're doing, it's jobs, and it's good jobs, solid jobs for people who want to live in rural Maryland and kind of keep that lifestyle.
Can you plug your website and we'll close it out?
Yeah, truechesapeake.com. Check it out and come join us for dinner if you're ever in Baltimore. Send an email if you're coming. Say you're with the Severn River Association, and we'll have some skinny dippers waiting for you.